What's up? Bunch of people in the chat here now. Actually, doesn't look like actually it's that many people. It just looks like the same people kind of having a little combo. Hajarian Gang is in the chat. So you got the Hajarian Gang, got a few people from Jones, some people from Gan. A little bit of a mix, a little hodgepodge. Call that a teacher potpourri, so to speak. I see Ayush and Amol from the Jones clan. I would say it's not a gang, it's a clan. Gang has a negative connotation. I think a little bit too much gang is a negative, unless you're talking about Gangnam Style. What's up, Mr. Chang? Hope things are going well for you. I was actually just talking about you the other day to somebody who I was talking about the stream and how you were a former student and you seem like you always pop back on even though you've graduated and everything. But hope things are going well for you, my dude. So let's just see if we got some questions coming in here. Let's see. Got Kyle Wong with a quick question. Can you go over convergent and divergent evolution? So, yeah, convergent and divergent, they're basically similar, but they just have a slight different twist to it. I always like to use an image. So let's take a quick look at an image here that I think could be useful. There's an image that I like to see. Is this one what I was talking about? Ancestor one? No. I mean that's good. These all are good. So let's talk about like this idea. So okay, so first of all, divergent evolution. I guess this is a little. This one maybe. Yeah, divergent. So divergent evolution. The way you can think about divergent evolution is just simply like the normal process of evolution and speciation. When you have an organism like on the right in this diagram here, with the butterflies, this is called divergent evolution because you start with a single ancestor, right? In the bottom you have this butterfly here, and then over time that butterfly sort of splits into varying species and diverges away from each other, right? Maybe maybe the butterflies here had two populations that get reproductively isolated in some way or another, maybe geographically or whatever. And over time, they evolve slightly different traits. So the divergent means diverging away from a common ancestor. Convergent means they don't have a common ancestor. And a good example, I always use this as an example. The wings, I always use wings as an example of convergent evolution because so many different species on Earth have evolved wings, but they've all evolved them separately. So birds, bats, lizards, right, or reptiles rather, are all species that have wings, but yet they're not related. They don't come from a common ancestor that had wings. It's not like you have a falcon, bat, and pterodactyl that you could trace all of their you can't trace their lineages back, their ancestry back, and find one common ancestor that had wings and gave rise to falcons, bats, and pterodactyls. Instead, what you find is that they all have different ancestors, and the wings evolved separately on different branches of the tree of life. So yeah, that's convergent, meaning you start in different locations on the family tree, and you end up with a similar trait, even though you're not related genetically. Whereas divergent evolution is kind of the opposite of that. I hope that helps. What's up, Akash and Ethan? I see you. Aisha, thanks for the explanation, Ayush and Aisha, on the convergent versus divergent. You guys both nailed it. Good stuff. Is it Aisha? Is that right? Aisha? Aisha. I think it's Aisha. Yeah. Yeah, so you guys talking about divergent, like speciation versus divergent evolution. Yeah, so speciation can result from divergent evolution, but they're not synonyms. That's a good point, Aisha. Aisha. Ayushta. Yeah, good combos, good stuff there. What's up, Emilian? Nice to see you. Jositha, I see you before. You're not my student, but I've seen you on here. Thanks, Mr. Chang. I think that that's your specialty, the law and order side of the spectrum. Someone said something. Arya, you asked, can you explain how to include selection strength in VIST? Good question. So selection strength, when you're talking about VIST, selection strength would go in the S part, and you would talk about basically, I mean, you don't necessarily, I don't think you need to include selection strength in the VIST answer to get full credit. Let me pull up the rubric, but I don't believe you need it. I think you just need to make sure identifying what the selection pressure is, and then also making sure that you talk about what the selection is for and against, right? The selection strength is just how strong the selection is. So you could say there is a strong selection against this or a weak selection against this. Selection strength is just a way of describing how quickly the evolution would take place. So for example, in the case of like the elephant tusks, you would say it's a very strong selection because it was over relatively few generations that the selection happened, or that the evolution happened, that the change happened. So you could include that for sure, but I would say overall, it's not necessary to include that in your answer. Rokia asks, can I explain what MRSA is? Yeah, MRSA stands for, I believe it stands for multiple resistant Staphylococcus aureus. Ooh, that's probably not, we don't want to see pictures of that. Sorry guys, I didn't mean to scar everyone for life with a quick flash of some MRSA infections. But MRSA is essentially it's a type of bacteria that has become very resistant to antibiotics. So it used to be called methicillin resistant because it became resistant to methicillin, but then all of a sudden it became resistant to more things. So MRSA is just particularly a very resistant type of antibiotic, type of bacteria to a lot of different antibiotics. But yeah, it's a bacteria. Yeah, you can see the Wikipedia article is methicillin resistant. Yeah, this is a type of bacteria. It has a lot of problems with it if you get it, because it's tough to treat because our medicines don't really work against it. Yvonne, what is descent with modification? Thanks, Amol, for asking that. Descent with modification is just the idea that as species descend from one another, like as parents have children and those children have children and offspring forward and forward and forward, they get modified over time due to the natural selection that occurs on them, and so the traits change over time. It's just it's the way to describe how evolution works. It's descent with modification. Some people tonight, everyone's in there with some really good explanations, helping each other out. Some good stuff. Jivith, can you explain stabilizing selection? Stabilizing selection is essentially when it's selected for the middle trait, right, in the middle trait. So you could look at those graphs. Looks like this. The classic graphs of stabilizing selection. These are the ones that I always use. I kind of drew. That's kind of a weird way to do it, actually. Is this one? What does this one look like? Yeah, this is a good one. So stabilizing selection right here on the right is when you have populations, let's say fur color, and over time, the ones in the middle, like the mid range of that. So you have dark and you have light, and then you have middle. Stabilizing selection is when the environment favors and selects for the middle trait and selects against the extremes. And so what happens is more and more individuals are in the middle color and less on the extremes. That's stabilizing. And you can kind of see how it's different than disruptive. Oh, they call it diversifying selection here. Interesting. I've always used the word disruptive, but in this diagram they use the word diversifying, which is, I guess, makes sense. Verse and then directional at the end there. So, yeah. So I'm going to be staying sort of, the chat is kind of going kind of quick. So I might be at the bottom of the chat a little bit. And if I miss your question. I apologize, because there's a lot of people coming in, and it's hard for me to tell who gets answered and who doesn't, but it looks like Amol and Jeevith, Ayush are answering questions, and Aisha as well. But I'll do my best to answer the ones that seem to slip through the cracks too. Rokia, can you explain I lost your question. Can I explain temporal isolation? Temporal isolation is essentially simply a way to describe a situation in which two populations no longer reproduce with each other because they are isolated due to some sort of reproductive timing, right? So you could imagine a population that reproduces, like they reproduce in, let's say, the spring, and then there's another population that reproduces in the summer. And because they reproduce in different times, they will never be able to reproduce with each other, these two populations, because the timing is off. And so that is a form of those two populations being isolated from each other due to timing. Just like you can have isolation of two populations due to geography with like a mountain or a river or a valley. And you have a variety of different ways populations can be reproductively isolated, and temporal isolation is just one way that's based off of timing. Aria, can I tell the difference between founder effect and geographical isolation? Well, they're kind of related. Like founder's effect, the founder effect is related to geographical isolation in the sense that you can imagine a situation in which you have a population in one place, and a small number of those population is maybe somehow gets moved to another location, like an island. Like the classic example is you have an island and a mainland, and there's a population on the mainland, and then the island. I feel like it's a little high. So you have the classic examples. You have essentially the mainland and an island, and what happens is a small group from the mainland population goes to the island for some way. Let's say it's just they get blown over there during a storm or something. Now those two populations are geographically isolated from each other, and they will not be able to interbreed. And on top of that, you might have the founder's effect might take place on that island because the founding members, or these relatively few individuals that are now on the island that came from the original population, might have will probably have a slightly different genetic makeup than what the average was of the original population. And so they're going to start a new population, and all of the descendants are going to be more similar to that small group, which might not be representative of the large group on the mainland. So you could have geographic isolation and founder's effect at the same time. Let's see, what else? Aisha asked, can you explain geographic distribution? Basically, geographic distribution is like, it's the way I would talk about geographic distribution is like the distribution of species on Earth based off of geography. So I think, let me look up another picture for this one that might help us. Let's see, geography, let's say in relation to evolution is what we're looking for. Yeah, I guess something like, yeah, the finches are a good example of geographic distribution. Like in this case, it's looking at butterflies, and looks like it's South America. And the idea is that all these butterflies are relatively closely related, and that's because and you can tell, and because they're closely related, they're usually going to be found in the similar geographic areas, because that just makes sense, right? Because as one population sort of expands, the further away you get, the more distantly related you could imagine species to be. And so the idea is that geography, things that are closer in geography, that tend to be more similar to each other. I think that's kind of a good example. So yeah, allele frequency. It looks like you guys kind of nailed allele frequency. Like allele frequency, like it looks like most people hit allele frequency, but the idea is allele frequency is this idea that you have a distribute. Like if you, I don't know if I don't know which class you're from, Sharon, but we did the breeding bunnies in our class. I think every class did breeding bunnies, and the each bunny has a set of genes, right, and a set of alleles. So every single individual in a population has its own genome, right, and all the different genes that it has, each gene has 2 alleles at least, and the individual would have 2 alleles, right? So the idea is that if you were to add up all of the individuals in a population and count the number of certain types of alleles, we will call that the allele frequency. So for example, talking about the breeding bunnies, we used fur density as a trait, and we said, hey, for fur density, let's just say there's 2 alleles. There's big B, which is thick fur, and little b, which is sparse or like not so dense fur. And if you look at every rabbit and you count up, right, how many little bees and how many big bees exist, that gives you the frequency of the little bees and the frequency of the big bees in the population. And the meaning behind allele frequency is that it connects to evolution, because as a population evolves, the frequency of alleles changes over time. So in our experiment, quote unquote, with the bunnies, we said that, oh, it's getting cold, and so individuals with thin fur die off because they can't keep warm enough. And so what we noticed is that the frequency of the little b allele, which was for thin fur, started to go down, because bunnies with that allele tended to die. And so the frequencies changed. And that was an indicator of evolution happening at the genetic level, which is what the level at which evolution actually is happening, is at the level of the DNA, right? And it just DNA is expressed in the physical traits that are selected for and against, but the changes are occurring at the DNA level over generations by allele frequencies changing, right? So if you look at the population of bunnies in year 1 and then year 5, they've evolved and their allele frequencies have changed, that population. Nice, Mr. Chang. Thanks. You got your first 2 paychecks. It's always nice to get that first paycheck of your adult life as you're like working career-wise, like your actual job. It's always a nice one. Congrats, dude. People are talking about genetic equilibrium and genetic drift. Yeah, genetic equilibrium, let's see. Yeah, good job. Aisha, nice. Genetic equilibrium is when there's a constant amount of alleles in the population. I think a better way of phrasing that, Aisha, instead of a constant amount of alleles would be to say that the allele frequencies remain the same. Right? So genetic equilibrium is a state in which a population of organisms are basically not evolving in the sense that their genetics are staying the same. So the word equilibrium means sort of to in balance or to stay the same, and genetic referring to the alleles and the genes. So if a population was in genetic equilibrium, it would not have a changing allele frequency from generation to generation, meaning it's not really evolving. It's a very unrealistic scenario in the fact that it doesn't happen in nature, but that is sort of like the case in which if you were to imagine a population not evolving, it would be in genetic equilibrium. And genetic drift is when the allele frequencies change, but it's due to random chance and not natural selection. That's the way I think about it. Like the difference between genetic drift and so you can think of allele frequencies. So here's a good way to think about it. You have a population, generation after generation after generation passes, and you're tracking their alleles. Like each generation, you count the number of alleles of the little b and the big B each time. You're counting it. If you see that the frequencies stay the same year after year, you are in genetic equilibrium. If you see that the allele frequencies are changing, you are no longer in genetic equilibrium and evolution is happening. Now the question then is it natural selection or is it genetic drift? Meaning, are the allele frequencies changing due to random chance because of meiosis when you shuffle your genes and you pass on randomly? You have no control over which genes are passed on, or sorry, which alleles are passed on. So it's possible that you get a random frequency change just due to probability. Or it could be that the frequency of alleles are changing non-randomly because there's natural selection occurring, meaning that some organisms are dying because they are not suited for the environment. So those are the three cases. You could have no evolution in which allele frequencies stay the same, or you could have evolution due to random chance as the allele frequencies change due to genetic drift, or you can have evolution due to natural selection in which the allele frequencies change due to the changing environment and individuals with certain alleles not being as suited, therefore not surviving and reproducing as much as individuals with the more suitable, more fit alleles. Those are your kind of three scenarios for this idea of allele frequencies. Amelia, what would the majority of the test be on? It's going to be on just sort of the basics of evolution. There'll be a couple questions on there about genetic drift and genetic equilibrium. The A level is going to be a VIST question with an example. So remember, to know how to be successful on the A level, in this case, you want to very much focus on that rubric and the writing guidelines. So for V, remember, it's very important for you to talk about the fact that populations have variation in their traits from the start, right? So a population, some individuals have slightly different traits than others, and that's the initial variation, right? That natural selection can act on. That variation can be passed on, that's the I. So the trait in question is a genetic trait. It needs to be able to be inherited by offspring, so it must be able to be passed on through sexual reproduction, that's the I. And then the S part is the selection, where you have to state what the selection pressure is, meaning what is the thing in the environment that is actually that is causing individuals to die or survive, that is causing individuals to be fit or not fit. So that would be in the case of, the bunnies, the selection pressure was the cold temperature. In the case of the flightless cormorants, the selection pressure was energy, right? The amount of energy required to maintain those wings was too high. in the case of bacteria, the selection pressure is antibiotics, because the antibiotics are selecting the strongest bacteria with the most resistance, right? And then you must tell me what the selection pressure is for and against. So, you know, in the case of the cormorants, the selection pressure was for shorter wings and against longer wings. And so that creates a differential survival and reproduction. So those with longer wings tended to survive less and reproduce less than those with shorter wings. So those with shorter wings ended up passing on their alleles more often. And so overall, and this is where you link it into the T part, the time, overall, over many generations, the wings became shorter and shorter. The average wing length became shorter and shorter because the allele frequencies for the frequencies of alleles that corresponds to shorter wings became more and more common. And remember, if there's any data in the example, you need to reference it, right? Maybe referencing that data in the time, in the T part, right? So give me exact numbers, like how much did it change, or over how many years, or how many generations, if that data is available. All right, so that's your rundown there on the VIST question. So, what's up, Maggie, Karan? Maggie, did you get your question answered about? Oh, you got your question answered. Yeah, remember, if your question's not getting answered completely, just type it right back in at the bottom. Nice. Thanks for the help. Looks like Karan and Maggie are helping people out. That's awesome. Good stuff. I like seeing that. Yeah, Vincent, do viruses evolve? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, remember in the very beginning of remember video lecture number 1, if you go back to video lecture number 1, what is life? And we talked about the characteristics of life. We talked about viruses not satisfying all of them, but viruses do satisfy the one characteristic of life, that is the ability to evolve, because viruses have DNA, and so over time their DNA changes. So this is actually one of the reasons. I mean, here's the thing: if viruses didn't evolve, then we would not need to get a flu vaccine every year, right? We would not need to get a flu shot every year. The reason why we get a flu shot every year is because from year to year, the virus evolves and changes. And our flu shot from last year no longer is effective at giving us immunity to the new flu that's evolved. So scientists have to develop a new vaccine every year, you know, and so that's what's going on with viruses. Looks like some people are talking about micro versus macro. Yeah, micro and macro. Micro is small changes over very short periods of time. Macro is large changes, like new species forming. Yeah, good stuff. Good, good, good. Avni, can I explain what the genetic variation in individuals and populations are and how to remember them? I'm kind of confused at your question. Can I explain what the genetic variation in individuals and populations are and how to remember them? Are you trying to get to the idea that every individual is different genetically, and therefore in a population you have a variety of different individuals? Because that's what we mean with talking about variation. I'm not sure what you mean by how to remember them. Because when you're asking me like how you should remember them, what I'm inferring you mean is that there's some things that you need to remember, like specific things. But when you talk about genetic variation in individuals and populations, there's nothing specific to remember. It's more of a concept. Like individuals, if you have a population of, let's say, 500 individuals, each individual has different genetics than each other, right? So you have a variation in the population, meaning that each individual has slightly different genes and slightly different, well, not different, sorry, excuse me, not different genes, but different alleles, different versions of the genes, right, if they're the same species. So there's nothing to really remember there, unless I'm not getting your question quite right. Yeah, so I think if Karana, you might be right with the way what she means, the difference between the two. Yeah. I mean, the difference, if the question is what's the difference between genetic variation at the individual level and at the population level, then you would say that within a population, there's genetic variation amongst the individuals, and then there is also even more variation between two different populations. That's the way I would think about that. Akash, so what factors actually cause bacteria to do horizontal gene transfer? That's actually a good question. I don't think I know the answer to that. Let's look it up. Let's look it up. What should we look up? We should look up like, let's look up horizontal gene transfer conditions. Let's see if Wikipedia has anything to offer on this. You don't need to know this for the test. This is well beyond. Like, I mean, obviously this is what we talk about with horizontal gene transfer. It's also called conjugation, is when you have two bacteria, they come into close contact, they create this bridge between the two cells, and then some DNA plasmids can go across the bridge from one to the other. But when do they do this? Like, what would it cause this to initiate and to happen? I'm not really sure. And I don't know. I think it'd probably be better for me to not kind of look into that right now, because it would probably take me a while to research that. And it's also not something you need to know for the test. What factors actually come up? Aisha, I just want to correct you on something you just said. You said I don't know what class you're in, but in Hajaran, I think all you need to know is horizontal gene transfer is what asexually reproducing organisms go through to reproduce. I just want to correct you on that, because that's not how they reproduce. The way asexual organisms reproduce is just simply through mitosis, right? So they just divide. Horizontal gene transfer is something that two bacteria can do with each other to exchange genetic information and share genes, and get advantages from being able to take genes from other bacteria, but it's not a reproduction event. It would not be considered reproduction. Reproduction is when you create a new organism, and that's not creating a new organism. Just wanted to clarify that for you. Sharon, can someone explain genetic drift? I think I've explained that before. I definitely have hit that a bunch. Genetic drift is essentially when you have allele frequencies change due to random chance and not natural selection. Thanks, Obni. Nice, that's a good answer. Eileen, in the introduction to population level, I don't get number 9, the results from flipping a coin 10 or 1,000 times and how that works for genetic drift. Yeah, okay, so that's just a statistical thing that a mole, yeah, you kind of talking about like this idea of binomial distribution. So essentially, yeah, the idea is that like genetic drift is when allele frequencies change due to random chance, right? And so it's hard to this. Let me see if I can explain this. So with the coin flipping analogy, essentially, if I flip a coin, so the way you can think of reproduction is like every time you reproduce, it's you're flipping a coin, right? In the sense of which alleles you pass on to your offspring. So if two organisms, right, reproduce sexually and they create an offspring, the mother and the father are basically flipping coins for which of the two alleles that they each have get passed on, right? So it's completely a flip of the coin. Now, if you only have a small population, you're not. It's akin to flipping a coin not that many times, right? Let's say you only have 100 individuals in the population, right? Or like maybe even 50. So that's 50 coin flips. So it's possible that and so when you have such a little amount of individuals and you're flipping a coin smaller amount of times, you're more likely to get sort of unusual results. And the analogy with the actual coin flip is if you flip a coin, let's say 10 times, you could end up with it's possible to have some weird outcome. Like normally you'd think if I flip a coin 10 times, it's a 50-50 chance every time, so I should have about 5 heads and 5 tails. But it's totally possible to end up with like 8 heads and 2 tails, right? Just due to random chance. So now it's only like 80% to 20%. But if I keep flipping that coin and I get to like 100 flips, then I keep flipping and I get to 1,000 flips, to 1,000,000 flips. The more I flip it, the more it tends to get closer and closer to that 50-50 number. The less times I flip it, the more the odds are that the more it can be not that 50-50 mix. So that relates to genetic drift in the sense that with small populations, it's more likely to get weird results and drift genetically, like have allele frequencies drift off than what you would expect than if you have like, a few thousand individuals reproducing. That's the coin flip analogy. I hope that makes sense. It's kind of an abstract concept. It's a statistical kind of thing. It's a mathematical idea. Omni, what does a lack of gene flow lead to? Speciation. Yeah, I mean, well, a lack of gene flow between two populations would definitely lead to eventually, potentially a speciation event. Because if you have two populations that can't exchange their genetics, there's no breeding between them. Now you have two isolated populations with no gene flow, and so over time, the environments that they're in will become different, and eventually they will evolve um, separate traits. So that's the idea of that. I can go down a rabbit hole on Wikipedia, or should I say I can go down a breeding bunny hole on Wikipedia. Yeah, this is like there's a lot of I don't know what the answer to that whole like when would a bacteria do that? Hmm. It's complicated. Some complicated stuff. Can I explain temporal isolation? Yeah, I explained that before, I think. Maybe you didn't hear it. But temporal isolation is this idea when you have two species, or two populations rather, that reproduce at different times. Their timing is off. So the timing could be different seasons. It could be different times of the day. If you're talking about like, insects or amphibians, where they do their mating call. Some amphibians will do their mating call in the morning, or some do like their mating call at night. So if two populations are attempting to reproduce at slightly different times, they are isolated from each other because all of these everyone in this population will be attempting to reproduce at the same time, right? So let's say you have a group of bullfrogs that do their croaking at, let's say, at dusk. And that's when the mating activity is taking place. Then you have another population of bullfrogs, that do their croaking at dawn, and that's when their mating activity takes place. So this group is mating at one time, and this group's mating at another time. They will never mate with each other because they're different. They're temporally isolated. Their timing is off. So temporal isolation is a specific example of reproductive isolation. Yeah, so Amol and Ayush, you're on the right track, but you just weren't specific enough. You guys were talking about, it is true that it's when two species cannot breed, or two populations cannot breed together. But the reason they can't breed together, and the reason why it's temporal isolation and not just, both of you are actually describing reproductive isolation, which is a broader term. And then underneath reproductive isolation, you have like temporal isolation, geographic isolation, and other particular ways in which populations could be isolated from each other. What's up, Nikhil? Apparently horizontal gene transfer also occurs in eukaryotes. Huh. I didn't know that. Like millet and rice plants. Like, but the horizontal gene transfer, is that occurring within an organism or between organisms? Like, are the cells in the millet plant or the rice plant exchanging genetics with other cells in that same plant, or is it like cells in one plant and cells in another plant are exchanging? Because that would be kind of, I'm trying to think of the reason. I'm trying to think of why it would happen within the same plant. Like, what would be the point? Amrita, is the only way an organism can lose a vestigial structure is if it's harmful to the organism? Let me think. That's definitely one way, for sure. Like if, but you wouldn't call it a so you wouldn't call it a vestigial structure. You would only ever use the word vestigial structure if the structure was not harmful nor beneficial to the organism. It was completely neutral. If it's harmful, it would no longer be a vestigial structure. It would be a structure that is slowly going away. And so let's just say that structure is, or that trait does cause a little bit of harm, meaning like individuals with that trait tend to reproduce less. Then eventually it will go away, right? Yeah, and that would no longer be a vestigial trait. It would just disappear. The other way it can go away is through repurposing. So the trait could actually evolve to become have another use, and then it would go away as well. So a vestigial trait can also be repurposed to do something new. But that means there has to be a selection pressure for the new purpose. a mole between two plants. They found genes that were not found in other rice, but was found in millet. Oh. Oh, so between millet and rice, I see what you're saying. So, okay, between two different species. Okay, wow, that's kind of crazy. I did not know that. Thanks for that info. I learned something. See, this is what we call horizontal knowledge transfer. I give you some knowledge, I get some knowledge back. Do a little knowledge conjugation kind of situation. Yeah, good point, Maggie. That's true. If there is a selection pressure, it's no longer vestigial. Either if the selection pressure is for it, it's not vestigial because it has a purpose. If the selection pressure is against it, then it's just, I mean, it'll eventually go away, so it's also not vestigial. By definition, if it's vestigial, it has to be completely neutral. Right, and so is it possible for a vestigial structure to not be vestigial anymore? Yeah, kind of like a mole said, it could be repurposed. It's possible. So if you remember the cormorants, the case study with the flightless birds with the really short wings, most likely those tiny little wings are not vestigial but repurposed. Like they probably serve some purpose. So there's some selection for maintaining those tiny little wings, whether it has to be to do with swimming in the water or something else. It's unlikely. It's unlikely that they're vestigial. Let's just put it that way. They probably have some sort of purpose. Can I have examples for stabilizing, disruptive, and directional? Okay, so this one's been asked quite a bit. I think let me see what this one is. So here's like a good little picture. So here's your three types of selection, right? Directional is selected against one of the extremes, right? The example here would be, and it looks like the example in this is tails, right? So the longer the tail, the more it looks like a snake. So it's selected for, which means shorter tails are selected against. And so over time, the average length of the tail increases. Stabilizing selection is when both extremes are selected against. And the middle, right, the middle trait or the mean trait is selected for. And so what you end up with something in the middle, right? So if we're sticking with the tail situation, long and short tails are disadvantaged. So short tails mess up the balance, long tails drag on the ground, medium tails are best, so they're selected for. That's stabilizing. And then disruptive, you can see, is the opposite of stabilizing. The medium trait or the mean is selected against, meaning the extremes are selected for. So you end up with potentially two populations evolving with different extremes of the trait, right? Long tails and short tails, but no medium tails. Avni, can I explain the four components of natural selection? Yeah, I'm just trying to make sure what everyone's saying here about the types of selection is true. I'm all look at M&M Lab. Stabilizing means going towards the middle. Yeah, medium blue is good. Maggie, directional is like when the finches get bigger because of the natural selection. Nice, nice, nice. I like that example, Maggie. I like that you guys bringing in examples from things that we've seen. And disruptive is the most common cause of speciation. Speciation is the opposite of stabilizing. Stabilizing selection is when the mean of the population does well. Nice, yeah, that's a good summary. Yeah, disruptive is rare. You know, I mean, imagine it's hard to imagine certain situations in which you have selection for both extremes. That's a relatively rare situation. Most common is directional and stabilizing. Like you can imagine, I think it's much easier to imagine situations in which one extreme is at the advantage or sort of a middle ground is at the advantage. That seems like a more likely scenario. The idea that you could have like two extremes both being equally selected for seems almost counterintuitive, right? So it is rare, but it happens. It's possible. Let me go back to someone. Oh yeah, Avni asked, can I explain the 4 components of natural selection? The 4 components of natural selection. I'm not sure what you're referencing with that. The 4 components of natural selection. Am I just being kind of dumb right now? Why do I not know what you mean by the 4 components of natural selection? Is that something I should know? Can anyone help me? I'm not sure what exactly the 4 components of natural selection are. I'm a little lost. Medhansh, can you explain coevolution? Yeah, good job, Amol. Coevolution is basically when 2 species evolve together. Yeah, Jositha, nice. Aisha, nice. Good. Yeah. Those everyone's kind of getting it. Right? Yeah, it's like it's when 2 species evolve together in response to each other. So, you know, like a classic example is usually like one species will evolve some sort of camouflage to blend in, and then the predator will evolve better vision to detect that camouflage, and then the other species has to then evolve even better camouflage. It's kind of like almost like a little bit of a evolutionary warfare going on back and forth. Yvonne, what is gene flow? And Amol, yeah, gene flow is basically the transfer of genes between 2 populations. Maggie, for the video in class about rock mice, wouldn't both extremes work in different parts of the environment, so would that be disruptive? Yeah, that could be disruptive, Maggie. That's a good example of one that happens in nature. I didn't even think about that. Yeah, like the dark mice on the lava and then the light mice on the sand would be disruptive for sure. Oh, maybe. The real Akash. Are you saying this? That's evolution. Maybe. Yeah. Is that what you were referring to, Avni? The 4 components of evolution being. No, but she said the 4 components of selection. The 4 components of evolution is variation, inheritance, selection, and time. That's VIST. But she said selection, and I'm not quite sure what she means by the components of selection. Yeah, no, not the types, but the components. It seems like everyone thinks you mean VIST, Avni. Do you mean VIST? Maggie, you're saying 1. Organisms produce many offspring and there are not enough resources. Variation exists. Struggle for existence. Favorable variations are inherited by offspring. Maybe. Maybe. I mean all that stuff's true, Maggie. Organisms produce many offspring and there are not enough resources. Yeah. Variation exists. Yeah. That's evolution though. That's not necessarily selection, because selection is basically three. The third part of that is selection. That all 4 of those, that's basically evolution. That's kind of like a VIST. Dog Rusty got a better ratio than YouTube Rewind. Hopefully, I better. YouTube Rewind. I think she means the different stuff like in the criteria for selection, the rubric. I think she means 4 conditions are needed for natural selection. On the theories of evolution and natural selection. Let me pull up that then. Let me pull it up. I'm pulling it up. So here is the natural, this one, selection. That might not be it. On the rubric, under S, this one. Well, yeah, I don't know. Maybe I can't figure that out, Avni. I'm sorry. I think just to sort of kind of put a plug in that little thing, I would say just the selection is, you should, if you're worried about like all the, like what selection is in general, you should look at the rubric and the writing guide, and that will help you. That's what I would say. Because I don't know, I'm not sure. I don't think there is such a thing as like 4 components of selection, at least not from what I remember. What else? Any other questions? Mechanical isolation is a form of reproductive isolation. Mechanical basically meaning that 2 populations can't reproduce with each other because they just don't have the right mechanisms to do it. Maybe they're different sizes and shapes and things like that. What's up, Derek? Your comment got hidden. Derek. So, Medhanj, so reproductive isolation is essentially when two species cannot interact to produce offspring. Exactly. Yeah. That's a good summary for sure. Let's see. For example, Amol, what are you talking about? For example, clinical trials, bacteriophages and antibiotics are used because bacteria can only get resistance to one. There is a 100% survival rate at this point. Oh yeah, I think the whole bacteriophage thing, that's an interesting one. I have to look into that. I don't know enough about that. Ethan, are crossing over and recombination the same thing? No, they're not. But they're not exactly the same thing. If you wanted to be really like accurate with it, they're different because in meiosis they're two different things. Recombination happens when recombination is basically which side of the cell the chromosome is split and moves to. And crossing over is like the actual mixing of the chromosomes, I would say, but both lead to variation, right? And again, I'm not testing you on meiosis here, so just be aware that they're different, but they actually both contribute to variation in the offspring during meiosis. Yeah, I want to see. Phage therapy, is that what you're talking about? Ooh, that's interesting. Bacteriophages are typically harmless not only to the host organism but also to other beneficial bacteria such as gut flora, reducing the chances of opportunistic infections. They have a high therapeutic index, that is, phage therapy would be expected to give rise to few side effects, even at higher than therapeutic levels. Phages are currently being used therapeutically to treat bacterial infections that do not respond to conventional antibiotics. So the first clinical trials were approved in 2019 for intravenous phage therapy. Okay, so this is kind of like a little bit of a new kind of branch. Kuzgesagt? How do you pronounce that? Kuzgesagt, right? Kuzgesagt? They have a bacteriophage video? Yeah. Let's see. Kuzgis. I don't even know how to spell it. Oh, I think I saw this already. I already watched this one.
A war has been raging for billions of years, killing trillions every single day, while we don't even notice. The war is fought by the single deadliest entity on our planet, the bacteriophage, or phage for short. Dice with 20 faces and 30 edges. It contains the genetic material of the virus and often sits on a long tail that has leg-like fibers. There are more phages on Earth than...
Sorry, I feel like you're probably getting weird double volume there because I have my speakers playing and you're hearing it through my microphone and through the computer audio.
Every other organism combined, including bacteria. And they are probably everywhere living things exist. Billions are on your hands, in your intestines, and your eyelids right now. Which might make you nervous since phages are responsible for the majority of deaths on Earth. But you're lucky. While they do commit genocide for breakfast, they only kill bacteria. Up to 40% of all bacteria in the oceans are killed by them every single day. But phages also have major flaws. Like any other virus, phages need a host to survive and reproduce. They're not much more than genetic material in a hull, and they specialize. Usually, a phage has chosen one specific bacteria and maybe some of its very close relatives. These are its prey. Imagine a phage as like a cruise missile that only hunts and kills members of one very unlucky family. When a phage finds its victim, it connects its tail fibers with receptors and uses a sort of syringe to puncture the surface. In a weird motion, the phage squeezes its tail and injects its genetic information. Within minutes...
So the analogous versus homologous thing is kind of tricky. But yeah, basically like the way you can think about it is analogous equals the same function, but evolved separately. So it would be like a bird's wing and a bat and an insect's wing. All three are wings, the same function is to fly, but they're all very different in terms of their structure, and they did not evolve from the same ancestor. They just sort of are, they kind of got the wing on their own in different ways. That's analogous structures. Homologous structures are those in which they have the same structure, they evolved from the same initial place, but have become slightly different in terms of their purpose and their function. So for example, that would be like the arm of a human, the wing of a bat, because a bat is a mammal, and the flipper of a whale. All are mammals. So even though the flipper, the wing, and the arm have all very different functions, they actually are all have the same structure. If you look at the bones, they have the same number of bones in the same locations. They've just been modified for different purposes. That's homologous.
The bacteria is taken over. It's now forced to manufacture all the parts of new phages. They only stop when the bacteria is filled up with brand new phages. In the final step, they produce endolysin, a powerful enzyme that punches a hole in the bacteria. The pressure is so high that the bacteria sort of vomits out all of its insides and dies. New phages are released and begin the cycle anew. In the last few years, bacteriophages have enjoyed the attention of the second deadliest beings on Earth, humans. Recently, we've started looking into injecting millions of them into our bodies because we're sort of getting desperate. We screwed up.
No, I'd say bacteria might be
in the past, a single cut or a sip from the wrong puddle could kill you. Bacteria were our phages, tiny monsters that hunted us mercilessly. But then, about 100 years ago, we found a solution in nature. By accident, we found fungi that produced a compound that killed bacteria.
Okay, yeah, no, I've seen, I know this, yeah. It's a good one. Bacteriophages are fascinating. I remember this video. Although I do want to watch this one, 12 arguments evolutionists should never use. apparently.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Alex, and
Actually, this is a guy, I don't know if any of you know who this is, Alex O'Connor, the Cosmic Skeptic. One of my favorite YouTube channels recently that I've been watching a lot of him. This kid is, he's I think he's like 20, early 20s. He's a philosophy major at Cambridge University. And the way he thinks, like his arguments and his way of approaching things is very clear. Big fan of his videos and just the way he thinks. He's very much like a philosopher at heart, in the sense that he kind of wants to figure out the right answers to everything, and I recommend it if you're interested in that kind of thought process, like thought puzzles. Is the video too loud? Am I playing the video at too high of a volume? Because I can dial the volume of the video down on my thing here. All right. Yeah, so. So Kyle, convergent, wait, who asked? Oh yeah, Medansh asked, how does convergent and divergent evolution work? Kind of talked about that a few different times. So I'm not going to keep going. That one I've hit on multiple times, convergent and divergent evolution. And everyone that's in the chat that's responding right now is kind of getting it right. Yeah, let me get my volume right, so if I play a video, and I'm talking at the same time, if you can hear me. So let's play.
as I'm sure you're aware by now, if you've been following.
Okay, so this is the video, audio video. Can you hear the video right now?
For the theory of evolution by natural selection, and I certainly don't think that anybody should be restricted of learning of its explanation for the origin of species. However, as I'm sure you're also aware, not everybody agrees with this opinion, and there's a prominent organization within the creationist movement called Answers in Genesis, which recently put out a list of 12 arguments that they think evolutionists should avoid using. So I thought that we
can you guys hear the video? I'm just trying to make sure my audio is good.
And of course, a link to the original article will be in the description down below if you want to go and check it out for yourself, but I'm going to try not to leave anything out here and now. Argument 1. Evolution is a fact. When our core beliefs are attacked, it's often easy for humans to retreat.
It's better, a little bit low. Some people can't hear it. I wonder why it's too loud for some people and not loud enough for others. Let's see if I can go find a middle ground. 16, let's go to like
to such statements as this. My belief is a fact,
what about this?
And yours is wrong. That's exactly why we cannot trust mere human understanding
to
explain
make
the
it
unobservable past. Emotion and pride get in the way. Evolution is not a fact, no matter how many times evolutionists say
if I turn this,
it's a framework built on assumptions about the past, assumptions that will never have direct, first-hand observational proof.
That's 100.
Now, I've said this before, but
everything is 100.
You can't directly observe an occurrence doesn't mean that you can't directly observe evidence for that occurrence.
And I think it looks like my voice should be definitely higher. On my mixer here, I'm looking at like,
and on the floor is a leaf.
Like if I show you like the mixer
on the tree. Now you didn't see that leaf fall off the tree, but you can assume that
right, like at the bottom here, the top green bar is the desktop audio, and then mine is down here, the audio input capture. So when I'm talking, you can see it jump up to like the yellow area. This one never jumps up, so I'm hoping that's about right.
Either. And look, evolution, like any other fact of nature, is a scientific fact, meaning that it's based upon inductive reasoning and is falsifiable. It's just that the likelihood of it being falsified is minuscule. For instance, if I were to take this book and hold it here, I'm pretty sure that if I let go, this is going to fall to the ground. Now, I can't be certain of this because, of course, I can't see the future, but based on inductive reasoning and things that I've seen in the past, I can assume that it's going to happen again. And that's science. Argument 2. Only the uneducated reject evolution. Besides the arrogance of such statements, this argument has no footing and should be cast off. Mainly, those who make this claim usually define educated people as those who accept evolution. Anyone who disagrees fails the test, no matter what their background. E.g., if we follow this ideology, Isaac
Ayush,
Newton
why
was
are
said to be
bacteriophages
uneducated.
still
The
not
problem
allowed
with
by the
logic
FDA?
being presented here
It
is
probably,
that
it's probably still in
education
clinical
is usually
trials. I mean,
focused,
I would
meaning
imagine, like
we-
at a certain, like with any sort of health thing, is going to have to go through many clinical trials to be proved absolutely safe. It takes a long time. No, Amelia, you do not need to know about bacteriophages. That was just sort of something that came up in the chat that we were talking about. At this point, the conversation has gone off more from the test, to be honest about it. It's kind of moved to different conversations, more about interesting things in science. And then I just started playing this video because I like this guy and it's about evolution. And yes, Kuzkasakt is a really good video. But I'm probably gonna have to wrap it up soon.
incredibly intelligent and incredibly educated, just not specifically, say, in evolutionary biology. For instance, I could meet someone who's incredibly well-read in poetry and say, well, what do you think about evolution? And they might say, well, I don't really know. I don't believe in it. I haven't seen the evidence. And that makes perfect sense. You have no reason to know about these things. And so it makes sense for you to be on the fence. That doesn't mean you're uneducated. It just means you're uneducated in evolution. And in fact, I'd say it's less accurate to say that it's those who disbelieve in evolution that are uneducated, but rather that people who are educated in evolution almost unanimously believe in it. And furthermore, when you do find that rare combination of people who both
what else we got? Any other questions before I kind of head out here for the night? You show me to play the bacteriophage video? I played a couple minutes of it. I did. But I don't really have time to play it again because I'm going to be moving on with the night. What are you asking? Can you explain coevolution? Yeah, let me give you an example of coevolution. I think I gave. Oh, I actually already talked about coevolution. But essentially, you have this idea that you have two species that are evolving in response to each other. So, for example, I gave the example of a predator and the prey. So, prey will attempt to, let's say, use camouflage to hide from a predator. The predator's vision might evolve over time to be more acute, to be able to spot the prey. And then the prey has to become more camouflaged. The predator's vision becomes better. And you get this sort of ratcheting up kind of situation. Or yeah, dog rescue, yeah. Bees and flowers is another really good example. So bees have developed very specific visual senses, and flowers evolve to produce visual senses that are attractive to bees, and bees have produced a visual sense that makes them attracted to flowers. So in kind of like this coevolution situation. All right. I think it's 8:53. I think it looks like it's mostly dying down. Okay. I don't know what you guys are talking about now. Aerogels and bifurcation diagrams. I don't know what's going on. But I think it's time for me to end it because I think we've kind of run aground here of all the questions that need to be answered. Yeah, people are still watching for sure. The good old days, of 80 plus concurrent viewers. I mean that'll happen. That happens, you know. It happens in the beginning of the year when people are like, it's sort of new and they want to kind of see what's going on, and then it kind of dies down. But it also it'll happen like when it's just a quiz tomorrow, right? So people are not so desperate for information. I don't know. Yeah. I actually do remember that video, the 96,000 balls on the reservoir one. Was that because it was used to, was that a way to heat it so it didn't freeze? I forget the reason why they put them on there. They were black, right? So they had to do something with like heat retention. And the Magnus effect one, yeah, the ones where they would drop they would sort of drop the ball spinning off the dam, and it would. Emilian, how long will the quiz take? I mean, I'll give you the whole period. You got 45 minutes to do it. Oh, but tomorrow's a rally day, so 40 minutes. It's a little bit of a shorter period, but it's just a quiz, so it'll be fine. It's from bromine poisoning? To protect the reservoir from poisoning? Oh. Okay. I got it wrong. I thought it was about heat for some reason. Oh, how many questions? I don't remember. I think it's like 20, no, 30? I think there's 30 questions. Something like that. Yeah. All right. All right. I think I'm going to do the same. I'm going to drop the mic and go study. It's like a mini test on Kita. Yeah. It's a short little one. It's like it's not as long as a normal test, but it's the same format, you know. It's got like maybe 15 C levels, 10 B levels, and an A level, something like that. It gets on the average between 25 and 30 questions. So, yep. All right. I'm going to go ahead and call it a quit. Akash, where do you get some prompts for Vist? I mean, pretty much just use any. You could kind of do it for anything. You could just look it up, like look up any trait, and then try and explain it with VIST. I don't have a key to help you, but you could just practice on any trait you see in the world because it applies to any trait. Like you could even do like the opposable thumbs in humans, which looks like that, right? You could use the opposable thumbs in humans. So yeah. Yeah, it's CBA, CB&A level for sure. Well, Mr. Chang, good luck on your social psych midterm on Wednesday, man. Good luck. I wish you the best. I wish everyone else the best on their quiz tomorrow. I'll see a lot of you in class. Other than that, if I don't see you, if I don't have you in class, good luck on your quiz and have a great break. And I'll see everybody when I see them. I think that's it for me. I think I'm gonna peace out now. So it was nice chatting with everybody. Have a good night, get some sleep, and I will see you all tomorrow. Fist bump. I'm out. Appreciate y'all. Have a good night.